Well, hello and welcome to the 7 signs for recognizing and effectively managing adult ADHD in the workplace webinar. My name is Holly Foxworth. I'm a registered nurse. I'm also the marketing manager for content, and so I'm extremely excited. I think we have one of our largest panels. I was laughing with Dr. Tree a while ago when we said it's our mega pint. It's our new favorite descriptor that we use to say something is large. So the large one is going to be our mega size there, and so they're going to be going through some of the different components. We'll get into some of the symptoms, things you're looking for, etc. Before we do that, and before I have our guests introduce themselves, I do want to tell you just a few things in case you're new here on the webinar. So what you'll see up in the right-hand corner, normally that's a next webinar that you register for. However, we are doing something special this next week. We are bringing on Dr. Scott Cherry, which is our Chief Medical Officer, but we're also bringing on our Chief Executive Officer, President and CEO, Mark. And so the two of them with Autumn actually are going to do a live stream next week. So that will be streamed on, Facebook. I believe we do Google and on YouTube, and then also I think it may be LinkedIn, if I'm not mistaken. But anyways, so those will be streamed live. You don't have to register for it. You should get a notification if you follow us on social that that's came up. And so they're going to talk about monkeypox. We're going to talk about the polio, some of these outbreaks that we're seeing that are starting to come up, and diseases that we thought were long gone. Now all of a sudden they're coming back and they're waving at us like hello. So they're going to go through all of those, all of the different implications, and help you get a plan together for what it is that you need to know and how you can manage that there in your workplace. So that there is in the right-hand corner. Below that, you should see also a box where you can type questions to us. So we are a talkative bunch, if you haven't already figured that out. So we love to talk, but we love to hear from you. So if there's any questions that you have at any point during the webinar, please type that into there to the box. We'll get those. We usually try to get them in the middle of the event, as they pertain to the subject that we're talking about. If not, we can wrap them up at the end. The other thing I was going to mention was that there's also some great resource links down there. So we've included I believe it's like a screening tool, real quick screening tool on how it is that if you think you might have ADHD, you wanted to look into something like that, that would give you kind of a screening and point of reference to know whether you need to be medically evaluated. Maybe things all of a sudden come into focus for you. In addition to that, we have the TIPA live information as well. I see if there's also some questions about, will this be recorded? Absolutely, yes, it is being recorded, and you will get a copy of the recording. Then it'll be emailed to you, the same link, and you'll just use the same information that you used to get here. So with that, I'm going to actually go ahead and turn it over to the panel and let them introduce themselves, and then we will get started with the content. So how about we start with you, Dr. Cherry? You want to kick us off?
Sure. Thanks, Holly. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Scott Cherry. I'm Axiom Medical's Chief Medical Officer. I'm a preventive medicine and public health physician that's been supporting for the past 15 or so years the military, government, and corporate industrial operations, and it's a pleasure to be with you today.
Awesome. We're glad to have you. And we're glad that you joined our girl panel here today with so many women here. All right, Dara Wheeler, tell us about you.
Yeah, I gotta say, go girl power today. Thanks for joining us, Scott. We're not gonna torture you too much, I promise. So I'm actually another CMO. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer. I don't have as many fancy doctor names behind my title, but I've been with Axiom for 16 years, and I'm really excited about this topic in this series. Glad to have additional people joining us today. So I'll go ahead and kick it over to Autumn.
Woohoo! Good afternoon. My name is Autumn Brennan. I'm Axiom Medical's Communications Director. I'm currently retired from 20 years of private practice in functional medicine. And functional medicine determines how and why an illness occurs and then restores health by addressing the root cause of the disease for those individuals. So I'm happy to join the conversation today.
Love it. And how about you, Sarah? I think you're our newest face here.
Yes, hi, I'm Sarah Hathaway. I am new to Axiom as the Director of Behavioral Health. I'm a licensed clinical social worker with about a decade of experience in the behavioral health world and primarily focusing on workplace mental health. So excited to be here.
Awesome. Awesome. We are tickled to have you. You're new to the Axiom family, and we're so excited about the many things that are going on over there with Tempo Life and those services. Shauna, how about you?
Hello, I'm Shauna Stone. I've been with Axiom for a little over 3 years, started out in injury case management, then moved over here recently to the behavioral health. Majority of my background has been in behavioral health, and I came to Axiom to work in the injury case management side. And once they were able to offer the behavioral health department, here I am. Thank y'all for having me.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us. Well, in terms of topics and kind of how this will flow today, so we'll kind of talk through adult ADHD, what it is, some of the signs that you would be able to recognize that by. We'll go through how it is that you would actually diagnose someone with that. I'm sure that you guys have all seen that you open up social media and it's like in every direction. You've got, Instagram, you've got TikTok, you've got Dr. Google. Everybody always has what they think is a diagnosis that's there, and they always want to put a label on you. So we'll talk about specifically what it takes to get that actual diagnosis, some of the treatment options that would be relatable, and my favorite part actually I think are some of these relatable life hacks. I think we've all decided that whether it's officially announced or not, we all have some of these tendencies when it comes to ADHD to some degree. And so I really like some of these life hacks that we came across. So then we'll go into the best practices. So with that, to kind of get us started, what I wanted to start with before we go over to Scott is just kind of Tom Hawkins. And so I found him and his story really jumped out at me. But anyways, what he had written was, he said, in retrospect, the signs were there all along that he was having difficulty concentrating, especially on things that didn't interest him. He said he had an awful short-term memory, inability to keep track of time, loss of emotional control. And he said that basically he had dealt with this for 40 years and never realized that he could actually have ADHD. And he said that, somebody had mentioned to him whenever they said the ADHD part, he thought, for sure the first time, absolutely, that's wrong, because I definitely do not have a problem with being hyperactive. I'm in slow mode. And so that's what jumped out at him, was that he realized that you don't actually have to be hyperactive to have adult ADHD here. So some of the things he had noticed was that, he'd always had trouble focusing on things. He had issues finishing things. We're great, especially all of us that had that creative part of our brain. We're really good at thinking these big ideas and starting projects, but then it's like when you get towards the end of that section, it's not as fun at that point, and so you'll fall off. The other things that he said was just kind of talked about his disorganization and the consequences of that, and then also not being able to hyper-focus. He would be hyper-focused on some things, but then others he would just completely miss the boat on the details. So that, he described that as tuning out the static, and I think that really resonated with me, but I'm sure it also resonates with you guys as well, because it just kind of puts things into perspective. So Scott, I'm going to kind of jump over to you and let you kind of talk us through initially what ADHD is and some of the things that go along with that.
Well, I think you had a great segue there with that example. In fact, ADHD was actually known as ADD up until like the late 80s or early 90s. And I actually still replay it as ADD in my mind. So it's interesting, your example there, where the person didn't have the hyperactivity component, felt like he didn't have ADHD. But, essentially you can look at an attention component or an attention deficit component or a hyperactivity component, and they can be powerful enough on their own based on those symptoms to be diagnosed. And so I think your example kind of just brings that to the part which I wasn't actually planning to talk about today, but, I thought it was just a perfect segue. But, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is one of the most common psychiatric disorders of childhood and adolescence that actually a large proportion of those young people end up becoming adults with ADHD. And to further complicate the matters, there's actually now studies that show adults who never had ADHD as a child now have ADHD. And, there's a lot of theories about our fast-paced life, technology, things, stimulants in our drinks, things like that, that could be starting that. But it really is based on three to five major groups of symptoms, to include inattention, which is really the hallmark of this disorder. But really, it also manifests with hyperactivity, which is more seen in children, but you can also see restlessness in usually adults. They don't really have the hyperactivity per se across the board. But what's really important about this, as we said, it's very common in childhood, adolescence, and now in adulthood, is that it really has significant impairment in really all of our activities of daily living. So social, relationships, academic, and occupational setting. And so it's really important to be aware of what ADHD is. And just like your example, Holly, people may have a misperception of it and not seek help, or at least an evaluation. There's two other topics with ADHD that I think are really important and hallmarks, where because of this inability to attend to things that are important or prioritized, or with the inability to stay relatively calm in certain settings, it really adds an additional massive stress to the person. And what happens there potentially is it can add to emotional dysregulation and even some cognitive challenges that really manifest again into this impairment into academic, social, and the occupational setting. And so there are studies that look at how ADHD affects employed populations. And if they're not well controlled, then they really are associated with significant injuries, traffic accidents, things like that. So it really is important, if you have some concerns for yourself or for others, that you really seek care as soon as possible. And so, really this is a very common and really impactful disorder that really affects many of us.
Yeah. The other thing that jumped out at me too, whenever we were looking through some of this research, was that the question came up of that, we didn't used to talk about adult ADHD, but now all of a sudden it's coming up. And so it's like, it gives you that clue, like, okay, so why all of a sudden are we having all of this? And it made so much sense when they explained that the reason why you may be seeing an uptick in some of this adult ADHD is actually because it was just missed whenever they were kids. So, it was like it was missed by the parents, or it was missed by teachers in school. Those are usually the ones where they're bringing it to your attention. And so it could be that you've had it all along, and maybe all of the things that had caused some challenges for you, there's a reason after all. So anyway, good deal. All right.
Well, Holly, I was gonna sorry, real quick, jump in on that. Can you sound better?
Yeah, you do. Yeah.
Hopefully it's coming through okay. I was just gonna mention too, I've heard a lot of stories recently about children being diagnosed with ADHD and the parents going through the same screening and going, oh, okay, I think I've had it all along. And so to your point, there's a lot of symptoms that maybe adults were coping with as children that they didn't recognize. We just didn't know enough about it. And it's now one of the most researched disorders, I think, out there. And so I was just saying that it's still not connecting to my headset. So I'll pause, but just wanted to say that I'll try to fix my headset and come back.
Yeah. Okay. It's okay. No worries. David, I see your question. I think that we'll jump into that when we talk about impulse control. And I think it's one or two more slides. So I definitely see you there, and we'll get to that piece. But I do want to hop over to Sarah and Shauna and let you guys kind of talk us through what some of those signs or some of the alerts would be in the workplace for these adults.
Thanks, Holly. And you and both Dr. Cherry really alluded to some of these things already. But right here, we're going to talk about how they show up in the workplace. And I think the first thing that I want to acknowledge is that ADHD can present both as challenges in the workplace, but also potential benefits, because we oftentimes, especially when we're talking about mental health challenges and mental illness, we talk so much about the impairment and the distress and how it impacts people negatively. But sometimes there are impacts of ADHD that cause people to really excel at work. So when we look at the inattention piece, as was mentioned here, oftentimes that results in difficulty focusing on work tasks, getting things done, sometimes missing deadlines at work, or maybe leaving tasks partially completed and having started many things without finishing them. But what's interesting about someone with ADHD is oftentimes they might also be really strong at certain tasks. So those brief tasks or those really time-sensitive things, because those are easier to hold one's attention to, those are the things where someone might really excel and be a star employee. But then if they get handed a lengthy project, something that's more complex, they may have a hard time getting started on that or really maintaining focus throughout. And that's when those deadlines are more likely to get missed. So again, there are those benefits and drawbacks here. With ADHD, because of that challenge with staying focused and the ability to become easily distracted, one can also be very forgetful. Sometimes maybe having a hard time remembering, well, what did we decide in that meeting? Or where did I leave my phone? Or, those little things that can be really important to staying on task and completing one's job duties might be forgotten of, well, gosh, I was paying so much attention to these things that were right in front of me that I forgot this really important priority. So it's important to pay attention again to both those positive and negatives. Some of the other things that we see are things like difficulty organizing tasks. Again, prioritization was mentioned. That's a big one. And we have here on the screen time management skills, but oftentimes what's viewed as time management is really an issue of attention management. While I might be able to manage my time and identify, well, I need to do this first and this second, but if my attention is pulled away by, gosh, I just got that message on Teams that distracted me, and I'm going to take care of that right away. Well, I forgot, or I left aside this one thing that was really my top priority for the day because something else came up in front of me. So those quick distractions, and especially in a virtual world, we've got email, we've got phones, we've got instant message, and so many other things that come along throughout our day. Those make it hard to maintain attention and maintain focus on activities. The last thing here I just want to call out as well is that difficulty listening to others. So if you've got all of these different distractions happening, it can be hard to pay attention to what's being said. It can be difficult to follow instructions. And that creates a big risk, especially when we're talking about those safety sensitive jobs. Well, if I can't listen well enough to follow the instructions and I'm getting easily distracted in my workplace, well, there might be this really safety sensitive or high risk situation right in front of me that I know I'm supposed to be paying attention to, but something else grabbed my attention now. And that's where accidents tend to occur.
Excellent point, Sarah. Shauna, you want to take the anything else you wanted to add to that? I think you may be on mute.
No, I don't have anything to add to that. Go ahead and give the workplace signs of the hyperactivity, impulsivity portion of the ADHD. You know, you can be sitting in the meeting. You always have that one person that's constantly shaking their leg that shakes the whole table, or the pen clicking it open and close. That one person or many people pacing around that just can't seem to be seated, which that's very hard for somebody to complete a task if they're having to do a lot of work at a computer. They get distracted by, you know, somebody calling out their name, calling their phone. They get up and they go to somebody else's cubicle or office and get distracted with the task at hand. There's on the go. I mean, it's like a motorboat just running around. They're going from here to there. You ask, where is such and such? Here they are. Well, they were over here, but now they're over in this area of the building. It's just like a motorboat, just constantly going, talking excessively. We always have the chatty Cathys, but they get disrupted whenever they are working on their assignments. And then, you know, just the little things that can just trigger them. They get to talking, they want to get up and visit, or they interrupt during, you know, a meeting, or when somebody's talking, they interrupt the conversation. They have something they have to say and get it out. And a lot of times I think I could be wrong. That could be because they want to get it out because they're going to forget about what they want to tell you before they get their chance. So that's just some of the common workplace signs that you may see in the workplace or see in adult ADHD.
Yeah, I think you just
maybe just to add a couple of points. I was just going to add a few points to the overall detail that you guys provided, which was excellent. You know, so I think all of us can relate to many of these things in isolation or to varying levels of severity or mildness. But what you're, you know, in many ways, what you're looking at is having multiple aspects of the inattention side or the hyperactivity side that are severe and really lead to impairment, right? So if you just have a couple of these that are, you know, just present but not really overly whelming, but this is how most psychological disorders are diagnosed, where you have to have like severity that leads to impairment in activities of daily living. And so, you know, it's easy to self-diagnose, to say, wow, I could actually do all these in the next hour or in the next week or so. But it's really about having, you know, probably at least 6 of these on each side that lead to really severe impairment.
I was going to say, hopefully my sound is better. Can you guys hear me? Okay.
It's okay.
Okay. Well, hopefully it's working. But
no, you're good. Go ahead.
So one of the things I was going to say was also there's a genetic component to this as well. So typically there's other family members that have been diagnosed similarly. So it isn't usually, unless you have something damage the brain, it's usually potentially genetic for the diagnosis as well.
Yeah, for sure. We had some questions. I noticed that the slide got moved. I don't know how that went to the next one, but we did have some questions. I think that this would be a good point to maybe bring some of them up. Let's see. So he was asking about the impulsivity, and was wanting to know, is that a reference to impulse control, a lack of impulse control? Who wants to maybe take that one?
I can take that piece. Yes, absolutely. It is a reference to impulse control. There's a higher level of that impulsive drive, which makes it more difficult for one to control those impulsive behaviors. So I can think of some friends and family members who struggle, particularly with having ADHD with that impulsivity. So it might be, well, gosh, I got this idea about this I all of a sudden found a new car that I think is really great, and tomorrow I just bought it. I didn't need a new car, but I just went ahead and did it. Or I impulsively went on a vacation, even though I, didn't have the time to take from work, and I had all these other priorities, but it sounded like a great idea, so I just went ahead and did it. So exactly what we're talking about with impulsivity is that ability to control the impulses when they occur. We see this more often with younger children, the kid who, despite the fact that there's busy traffic, they'll run right out into the road. So it's more apparent with young children, but it does still apply in adulthood as well.
Yeah, for sure. And then Cheryl was asking about, Danielle, we'll get to the diagnosing in just a second, but Cheryl was asking about, are the symptoms always that extreme? That's a great question.
Extreme. That's a good question. I wouldn't necessarily say that they have to be extreme, but they do have to have that negative impact on one's life or work in order to fall into the ADHD criteria. So for some, ADHD can be very internal, and especially if it's the inattention, it might not be something that's especially observable by others, but someone may still struggle with that inattention, may struggle to stay on task, but still outwardly present well. You can still be high functioning and have ADHD. So I wouldn't necessarily say that it has to be extreme, but it does have to have a significant impact on one's life.
Gotcha. Okay. Excellent information. I don't know, Dara, are you back in where we can hear you now?
I hope. It doesn't sound
okay.
like.
All right.
I don't know. Apparently, it's still echoing. I guess it's not picking up my headset.
I think it's just your new big house. Yeah.
I don't know.
It's your new big house.
It's hating me. I don't. This sounds better to me, but I think it's less good to the audience. I don't know. So I'll maybe just jump and say a couple things. But Holly, you may just want to take this, so we can make sure people get this.
Yeah. Well, and what we're going to kind of talk through here was the health and wellness implications that kind of come along with some of these things. And the first piece is that, especially when you have that hyperactivity and your brain's always talking all of the time, it's like it feels like everything's spinning all the time, or even how Tom had explained there that it feels like static. You've got static that's going on all the time. And so you'll see that there can be a lot of fatigue. They're worn out. Maybe use a lot of energy. There may be some sleep disturbances that are there, but also this impulse control, as Sarah's referenced, usually if you're not focused and you're not thinking things through completely, you're going to have an imbalanced diet. You're probably, going to sit at your desk and keep working right on through lunch and not take it because you're so hyper focused on what's going on. You lose track of time. A lot of times they'll have a lot of anxiety or stress, because your mind is just so big and it's going in so many different directions, and you feel like that you need to get this done. It's kind of hard sometimes to prioritize or really see the implications and prioritize some of the tasks that you may be working on. And then the other pieces were the relationship components. It's hard to communicate sometimes if you can't talk and the other person listens and then they talk and then you're quiet and you're actually listening, not just looking at them, but actually listening to what it is that they have to say. And so I think Sarah covered some of those that could be related to that relationship piece. And then the last one was the substance misuse. And we've seen such a huge uptick in that this year. And especially when COVID started, we saw that there was a sudden increase, not just in hardcore drugs per se, but also in alcohol. And so it doesn't look like that's going anywhere anytime soon. Those numbers are still up. The projections are significant. Dara and I were looking at those the other day. People have picked up new habits. And so, anything that you did to your body from that in is going to have a long-term effect on what your overall general health and wellness is there. Dara or Scott, anything either one of you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I want to say one quick thing, and hopefully you can hear me. I'm sorry. One quick thing. One of the things that is clear is in the research is that it's if it's undiagnosed or you're not treated, it can lead to things like substance use. And one of the parts of impulsivity that is interesting could be things like obesity and some other issues around health, because that impulse control, and a lot of this is that executive functioning part of your brain, which has if you're struggling with ADHD, that seems to be the part of the brain that really has a hard time managing impulse and managing these components, which can lead to some of these concerns around substance use and diet. But that's if it's untreated. So one of the reasons that it's really important to get diagnosed and support is that you can learn how to cope and how to manage some of these components and not lead to some further health concerns down the line. Sorry, Scott, go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just to kind of add to that, there are really robust studies that look at comorbidities with ADHD, and it really is a high risk for other behavioral health diagnoses, such as substance abuse, and also mood disorders and things along those lines. And you can kind of see from a plausibility perspective, it makes sense. People abuse substances to help cope. And there's actually additional thinking that some of this, those with undiagnosed, untreated ADHD actually seek out certain illicit substance to kind of self-medicate, which are a lot like the legal medications that are being prescribed for them. And, when you look at this chart here too, these are implications to your health and wellness, to your overall life, but they're also reasons to exacerbate your ADHD. And so you kind of have this vicious cycle in many ways where if your ADHD is not well managed, all of these things are going to worsen. And so that's obviously not good. But also as things, just stress and anxiety is a regular occurrence in most of our lives. So as stress ramps up, it can actually make your ADHD even worse. And all of these can. And I think Darren and I will kind of speak to this more specifically for a way to focus this from an occupational programmatic perspective. But, this is definitely something that has huge implications. I kind of wanted to go back to what Sarah was saying too about impulsivity. And, I think you had some great examples of taking a trip all of a sudden or buying a car all of a sudden. But I may know someone who may buy a new car every 3 months, right? And so this has been going on for several years now. So that's like 20 cars in 3 years, right? And so, it's one thing to buy a car impulsively, right? But it's another thing to buy 20 cars, impulsively, right? And same thing with shopping. And so I just wanted to provide that kind of nuance that we all do things impulsively, but, it's almost hard to do things that impulsively unless you do have something going on. So, and I think people will beat themselves up because it's like, I just need self-control. I need willpower. And I think that's also a generational difference, right, Dara, where my generation, maybe there was less ADD diagnosed because the way children were viewed when I was a kid was to be tough and to deal with it. And it's a lack of discipline. And so I'm still working through that. Yeah. But,
I think historical views for sure. Yeah, I think historical views for sure were that it was just bad parenting, right? It's I think been very clear that the research has shifted significantly in the last 20 years around the diagnosis of this and how to treat it and how to manage it. And I think we're still learning a lot. I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but I do think historically it was just, bad parenting, that kid's wild or hyper or just figure it out. But I think that thought process has shifted a lot, but we still are weeding through how to kind of change the way we think about this as a culture.
For sure. Yeah. Sean and Sarah, you guys want to talk about how it is that they actually arrive at a diagnosis of adult ADHD? And then I saw that we had some questions in here that are related to that as well. So we'll pick those up after you guys get through giving us an explanation.
So I'll let Shauna go ahead and start on the diagnostic criteria, and then we'll talk a little bit more about some of what Dr. Cherry was getting at as well.
Okay.
Okay. Some of the diagnostic criteria for ADHD is the symptoms or behaviors that have persisted greater than 6 months in 2 or more settings, like work, relationship-wise, school, home. And then they have to, like Sarah said, they have to negatively impact their life within the work setting, or just basically life in general. Patients less than 17 years old have to have 6 or more symptoms to be diagnosed, and those at 17 and over, they have to have at least 5 symptoms in one of these settings.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's important to recognize. There's the 3 different components when you if you are diagnosed with ADHD, you can be diagnosed with predominantly inattentive ADHD, which means that you fall into that category. You can fall into the predominantly hyperactive category, or there's a combined type where your symptoms fall in both categories. So it's important, again, to when we look at those symptoms and those behaviors, to recognize that just because we can fall into some of these behaviors at some time doesn't mean that we meet the criteria for the diagnosis. And so it's important that we be mindful of that. We also have to recognize that some of these symptoms are, and these behaviors are indicative of other conditions as well. They can be indicative of an anxiety disorder. They can be indicative of a high level of stress, or someone who's grieving, someone who has experienced a recent trauma. So there are many things that can lead to some of these signs and symptoms that we're talking about here. And that's why it's so important to see a professional, get a proper diagnosis if you are concerned that you might have ADHD, or if you are noticing, hey, I'm ticking a lot of these boxes and I have been for a while.
Mm-hmm, definitely. Adam, let's go over to you and let's kind of talk about some of these treatment options then that would be relatable, because there's such a range of everything from medication to therapy to there's a whole discussion of holistic therapy. So talk us through some of those things that can be utilized.
Of course. Well, as we know, everyone's going to have a different presentation of their symptoms. So some of us that might be impulse shoppers might also have sleep disruption. So once again, this is something that you have to kind of play with and be open to, trying a bunch of different things alongside your care practitioner. So starting with cognitive behavioral therapy, it's based upon the idea that thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are all connected. So oftentimes you'll see the triangle. And if you change one, the other two will also change for the better. So sometimes we can get stuck in repetitive thoughts. Like, for instance, I have a deadline. Why can't I focus? I'm so bad at this. And then imposter syndrome. And you just start spiraling. So there's a way to kind of break that up and break that down. And what's great about cognitive behavioral therapy is you can do it as a homework project and do it on your own through writing prompts and journaling, or you can do it alongside a therapist. And the combo platter actually works the best. So for instance, some of the journaling prompts that you can do just to start out, and not everyone has to be diagnosed with ADHD to do this, is to really look at that situation. What is the situation? Is it an event or a topic? What are your general feelings that are spiked right now if you're in one of those spirals? What are you thinking about? What do you believe about it? Is there a limiting belief like this deadline, I'm never going to make it? And then you just keep spinning on that thought, right? And what are the consequences of the thought? How does it affect you? Does it make my heart race? Does it make me sweat? Does it make me angry? Do I feel like a failure? Those kinds of things. And then you really want to look at your limiting beliefs around that. and rewrite that whole story without that distorted thinking. So we want to identify what's really true for me, what's really true about this situation. What's great about cognitive behavioral therapy is you can have a partner in that, an accountability partner who's like, am I looking through this correctly? Is this really the reality? And kind of ask for feedback. And that's the beauty of having psychologically safe teams in the workplace, is that you can say, hey, I'm really struggling with this deadline. Am I overthinking it? Am I underthinking it? Can you help me out? So cognitive behavioral therapy is something you can do alone, you can do with a group, and of course you can do it with a therapist. But there's little ways to break it down into little daily homeworks and journal prompts that can help kind of keep you a little more regulated. So that is one great therapy to use. Key practices for effective management. So that comes into this cognitive behavioral reality where we're starting to understand a little bit more about our own rhythm and ritual. You know, if you wake up in the morning and you immediately start scrolling for TikTok, you're going to be getting all the dopamine hits that are going to be setting you up for the rest of the day. And that might be your key distractor for the rest of the day. So what we do first thing in the morning sets the tone and the pace for the rest of our day. So ideally, if we could wave a magic wand, meditation. And I know everyone rolls their eyes when they hear, let's talk about mindfulness and meditation. And the first thing I hear every time is, I'm really bad at meditation. I just can't quiet my mind. And my point is, that's the point. We need to learn to quiet our minds, and it's not going to be easy in the beginning. But a great way to start out is to just listen to a guided meditation from YouTube. A little 10 minutes to the beginning of your day can set you up for productivity, for calm, centered behaviors, and can really, really help. And the more you do it, the better you get at it. Meditation is called a practice because practice doesn't make perfect. It makes more practice. And one day is going to be very different from the next, and there's no scores and nobody wins except everybody. So meditation is something I would highly recommend. And we know that this works because neuroimaging suggests that mindfulness meditation in particular engenders neuroplastic changes that you can see when someone's in that space. And it actually feeds that prefrontal cortex and fuels our executive function. So meditation is medically proven, and it's fun to do. And it's something that you can also do in a group. In fact, our marketing team has been doing it in the morning. Thanks to Holly. So simple 10, 15 minutes at the beginning of your day and right before you go to bed is huge. Another key practice, and we talked about this briefly in another slide, is sleep. Most people who struggle with ADHD also struggle with sleep. You don't have to be hyperactive to struggle with sleep. It can be your mental monkeys taking you on a magic carpet ride, and you need to calm those down. So doing a meditation before bed, and then really creating a ritual around your sleep. That means getting off your screens early. It means not eating sugary foods right before you go to bed. Maybe you stop eating around 7, so you have a kind of an empty stomach and can kind of flow into a sleep. But I would say focusing on your sleep is a huge piece of this because it plays into many other mental behavioral issues that could also be affected. Like, for instance, if you have anxiety or depression, sleep can also be disrupted. So if you fix sleep, many other things fall into place naturally. Some of the medications for ADHD, I don't want to dive deeply into the medications, but they typically fall in 2 classes of stimulating and non-stimulating. And just recently, I read some research from a psychiatrist who found that people who have ADHD and mild depression can really benefit from Wellbutrin. There's something about the slightly stimulating effects of Wellbutrin that help adult ADHD. I've just heard about it. There's just some new research around it. So if you kind of are in both of those camps, to maybe investigate if Wellbutrin is right for you. Along with medications, we also have alternatives to medication. And the reason for this is that not everyone is suited for medication. You have to talk about that with your doctor, see if it's a good fit for you. And you might have to try a couple different kinds to find out what really fits. So there's a ton of plants and medicines out there. I even brought some along today to show. So what I've been bombarded with on TikTok are Alpha Brain commercials. So of course, me being functional medicine herbalist, I wanted to buy it right away and try it. I'm not promoting it in any way, shape, or form. The ingredients in it look great. They're phenomenal. Results are going to vary person to person because we are all individuals and need to find out what works for us best. But there are some long-term, there's some plant medicine within that have been used for thousands of years for stimulating your brain function, including ginkgo biloba, which is a very beautiful tree and is one of the oldest trees on the planet, but it does oxygenate your brain and allow some flow to go through there. So if you are spinning out of control, having a nootropic plant in your system can help sharpen that focus and activate more oxygen to your brain and just clear things up. Gotu kola is another remedy in there, or another plant medicine in there. There's also one thing that I recommend, especially for adults with ADHD and women who might have ADHD as well, is ashwagandha. Ashwagandha is in a plant family called a tonic herb. So if you are really hyper or are really depressed, it kind of is that balancing act. It's a tonic herb, so it helps your adrenals kind of balance the cortisol, serotonin, melatonin. It keeps everything on an even keel. It's something that you can take over time. It's a tonic plant, so it doesn't build up and there's no toxic side effects of that. But the biggest thing, and I say this because 98% of Americans are deficient in it, is omega-3. It's brain food. Our bodies need it, absolutely. So if 98% of us are deficient in it, none of us are really working to our brain's full potential, right? And so what I love about omega-3 is it comes in a bunch of different forms. This is a liquid form that tastes absolutely fabulous. And this is vegan. This is made from flaxseed. And then this is another one. You'll probably hear about omega-3 fish oils. Here's one that looks like that. I'm trying to find my camera. The nervous system is obviously a huge part of all of this. And when we don't have enough omega-3, we are basically not able to have a very nice padding around each of our nerve cells. Your myelin sheath around every nerve cell requires omega-3 to function. And most of those nerve cells and most of our brain needs omega-3 in a major way. So I personally notice when I am deficient in omega-3 or when I forget to take it, when I am back on omega-3, I feel a sense of calm. I really do. I feel like everything is just a little easier. It's like kind of oiling the Tin Man of your brain. I'm into it.
Mm-hmm.
And you can get those anywhere. It's just a food it's a food supplement.
Yeah.
So a big part of this is regulating our nervous system. I talk about regulating our nervous system a lot. So what are the things that you can control? Of course, you can control how much water you're intaking. We see hydrate, making sure that you are hydrated. Most people who are self-medicating with ADHD tend to really love caffeine and energy drinks, I being one of them. And that can be great until it's not great, until it causes adrenal weakness. So getting the proper, herbal teas and water and non-sugary drinks, Holly, and things like that are really helpful. When we talk about phones being the enemy, let's expand that to all of our screens. At any given point, many of us have multiple computers going on. We have a TV in the background. We have our phones that we're constantly checking. And when we think through the lens of stimuli, we are in a constant state of hyperstimulation. We are having information flying at us from every direction. Our brains aren't meant for that. I mean, think about, even 100 years ago, how much information they could process at a time. There was only so much there, right? And now we're in a hyperspace of information flying at us. So it is a lot of like just toning it down. That's why I'm a big believer in that nighttime ritual of just being screen free for ideally an hour or more before you go to bed, just so you can kind of detox some of that. One of my favorite quick fixes is aromatherapy. And so what I love about aromatherapy is that within 2 seconds, I have an immediate medicine to my central nervous system. And so one of the best things I do, and what I would recommend to other people, as long as it's safe for your own personal use, is peppermint oil. Super simple, not very expensive, probably $3 to $5 a bottle. But you immediately open it up, take a little whiff, and you can feel yourself become focused. And it's one of those oxygenation to the brain activities that's going on. It smells good. It tastes good. Don't put it directly in your eyeballs. But if you can just take a couple whiffs during the day, if you have something you really need to hyper focus on, it's phenomenal for just getting that clarity that you need. I love your bit about procrastination. What we know about ADHD is we tend to not do things unless it's an absolute emergency and urgent. So you see that in the behaviors around bill paying. You see that in behaviors around projects. You see that around a lot of behaviors with ADHD. And you're right, don't let the perfect be the enemy of good. But also, I think there's a way to really get caught up in the analysis paralysis, where we're so busy in the research state of a project that we don't get to the actual production stage. And I know a lot of us have been there. So some of those other relatable brain hacks, I think another one is to really focus on when you are overwhelmed. There's a couple different remedies. Of course, limit your to-do lists. I remember many years ago, I had an assistant that was profoundly ADHD and heavily medicated. And we had a big deadline that was just eating him alive. And I said, how can I support you on this? He says, I can't look at this list of things to do. I need 3 things. 3 things, that's it. I need them big. I need them in front of me. And I got him a whiteboard, wrote 3 things on it every day, big magic marker, cross them off. You need that sense of accomplishment, that sense of delayed gratification. And sometimes if you focus on getting the feeling place of what does it feel like to get that done, I'll be so relieved when it's done. Attaching yourself to that feeling place is a really great way to get past the overwhelm. Another thing you can do when you're overwhelmed, and that it tends to happen when we're surrounded by screens, is we don't spend enough time outdoors. So one thing that I like to do when the weather's nice is take off my shoes and just stand in the grass, walk around in nature, get away from the screens, get back into my body, get rooted in the earth. And this is what I can control right now. I can focus on my breathing. I can take 4 deep breaths in, hold at the top, and take 4 deep breaths out, hold at the bottom, and step outside and walk barefoot. 10 minutes of that is like a hard reset for your nervous system and your brain. So we love that. We talk a little bit about the manufactured serotonin playlist. I'm a big fan of that. So at night, I listen to binaural beats, which synchronize both sides of your brain. And during the day, you can find playlists that are created that do help you kind of sink into the right brain waves for productivity. One thing I listen to is house music. And there's certain beats per minute that are really good for your brain to kind of get you into a rhythm of productivity. Another fun thing that I do for time management, here's my jam. I'm an optimist, almost to a fault. So if I think a project's going to take me an hour, it's probably going to take 3 hours. But what I've done, instead of setting alarms for myself and setting times for myself, I do this. It's a Pomodoro technique. So the Pomodoro technique doesn't include numbers or digital things or a screen, which I love. But basically, you work for 25 minutes and then you take a 5-minute break. And you kind of understand a little bit more about how each project works. And okay, this will take 3 rounds of a Pomodoro. This will take 2 rounds. And you start tracking how long things take. And then you can start blocking out your calendar accordingly. So there's a lot of things you can do to trick your brain into taking action. And I love the Pomodoro technique because I can't monkey with the numbers. I'm not looking at the clock saying, okay, I've got 3 minutes left. And then you change your deadline. I'm looking at sand through the hourglass and I can't change it. So those are some great tips and tricks that I would recommend.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. I love it, Autumn. All right. Let's go back to Dr. Cherry and Darren, kind of talk through some of those best practices then. So now we know what it is. We all know that we're a mess, and we fall into this category, and we've all diagnosed ourselves with ADHD as an adult, and we're going to get to the questions. But so how is it then, well, now that we all have ADHD, how is it that you're going to manage those in your workplace? Darren, you want to start out?
Sure, and I want to be brief because I do want to get to some of these questions here. I do think that although this is a personal diagnosis, not a work-related diagnosis, it does affect probably a large number of all of our employees that we work with, whether we know it or not, or whether they know it or not. So having a good program and benefits team to think about how to manage and provide support to employees, whether it's ADHD or other concerns, like Sarah very clearly pointed out, it may not be ADHD, maybe it's an anxiety disorder, maybe there's other reasons that you're displaying symptoms. But either way, we need to be supporting employees as proactively as we can and with the best programs we can. So I also think that one thing we've embraced internally is mental health first aid. And making it something that just becomes a part of our culture internally. And that's a big piece of changing, we've all heard this term stigma, and I do think that some of our younger generations in the workforce are used to sharing a lot on social media like TikTok, but that doesn't mean the cultures that we all work in have changed. So when we think about how we support employees, one of the biggest things is having these discussions. So although this is a formal webinar that we are presenting to all of you, it is also something that our teams talk about on a regular basis. We bring up things, challenges that we're going through, our children being diagnosed, learning about it through the experience through them. I just went through that personally, learning that my daughter had ADHD and going through the symptoms, going, oh, this is interesting, and recognizing some of that in myself and my husband. So I do think that being open about that with our teams is a big step forward. And then Scott, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, I think specifically trying to develop as much of a comprehensive program as possible is going to be more effective than doing it piecemeal. But again, if you only have resources or kind of this timeline to do piecemeal one at a time, that would be, better than not doing anything. But what we've been focusing on here at Axiom is really employee resilience across all of the behavioral health concerns. And so obviously ADHD is one of the most popular childhood or most common childhood diagnoses, but it is leaking into adulthood as well. But really having a way to look at your employees' resilience at the population level is really important to help manage your human capital. We all kind of have surges in our demands from the workplace. And so having that population view is absolutely critical. And then it bleeds into some of the things we were talking about today with executive functioning, emotional dysregulation, where stress, anxiety from additional workload can really affect everyone's behavioral or mental health. And so again, resiliency, I think, is really a key thing that's going to be the future of population health in the workplace. And I think I'll hold it there just as we can hit some of these questions before it's too late.
That'd be awesome. Yeah. My favorite question that I saw on here was from Latrice, and she was saying, do some employers report that ADHD workers do in remote work activity from home, or do they get distracted and work productivity is worse? I thought that was a brilliant question, and it's so relevant to what we are dealing with right now. Who wants to take it? Not everybody at once.
I can give a few points. So I think it depends on the person, and I think that's that's like me channeling Dr. Curte, and I think Sarah addressed it well too. It depends on which category of ADHD you're kind of diagnosed as. So the impulsivity versus the attention side, and I think it really matters. And maybe the last part of the last slide was accommodations, which I actually think is important. And Autumn gave a great example of almost an informal accommodation by a leader to their direct report, where they can actually abbreviate their task list, and things like that. And everything's going to be tailored for what's working with just depending on a case by case scenario. But I don't think you can generalize to this kind of from a blanket statement, though.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know we're running out of time. There was a couple other questions real quick that I would really like to address. There was a question about what happens next after diagnosis and what does that mean and why it's important and who can diagnose. So Sarah, can you give us a little bit of information on who can diagnose somebody with ADHD?
Sure. As far as who can diagnose, any medical doctor can diagnose, mental health professionals can diagnose in most fields. My recommendation, though, is, if possible, a psychologist is going to be the best individual to fully evaluate for ADHD because they can do actual cognitive testing. And that's going to help to get the most accurate diagnosis. So I would recommend a psychologist if accessible, but I recognize that sometimes accessibility is a challenge. Being able to get into that particular provider is a challenge. So if you start with your primary care doctor or therapist, that's a great place to start as well, in order to get you down that road of having a proper diagnosis.
And I do think the piece about why and what it means to get diagnosed and what it means for after. And I think whether you're diagnosed and you start a treatment plan, whatever the treatment plan is, then you can learn to cope. And like you said, it doesn't become a detriment. It's not always a negative. There's a lot of really positive things. Some of the most interesting creative people in the world were diagnosed with ADHD, but it's learning how to live with it and cope with it and what the various skills. So it may be a combination of a lot of things that you could work with your providers on how to address it.
Absolutely. And it helps to unlock a bit of a framework for how to address it, right? If it's anxiety versus ADHD versus, high levels of stress, those are going to be tackled a bit differently. And especially when we're talking about medication, it allows you to access medication that you might not otherwise without that appropriate diagnosis. So I think that's really important.
Yeah. Guys, thank you so much for joining us today. It looks like that we've had some great discussion. I saw there's some questions that were on here. We can follow up with you individually. It makes me feel good and it warms my heart that we can have these conversations in an open setting now, and that everybody can feel comfortable communicating and kind of talking about things that maybe one, in the past had been unmentionable, or you just kind of hold those in. So I appreciate you joining us. We obviously always keep all your information confidential here. If there's ever a question you were to ask, we would not share your information with anybody else. That we definitely would always protect that. So we appreciate you coming. A reminder, don't forget, this next week we're having the special event. It's called What We Don't Know Can Hurt Us, and that is specific to your next move with managing the monkeypox and polio endemics. And we're going to have our CMO, the male version, Scott, and then we'll have Mark, our CEO, and I think that Autumn is going to be hosting that while Jared and I are out of town. So thank you for joining. We look forward to seeing you at the next event, and we appreciate you. Have a good day.
Thanks, Holly. Thanks, everyone.